You smell it before you see anything. A thick, wet sweetness, lavender oil and ambergris dumped over something that doesn't belong in a palace. Something biological, something wrong. The candles in the bedchamber at Versailles are burning on every surface, 40 of them at least, and not one can overpower what's coming from the bed. This is what really happened to the most powerful body in Europe. You step closer. The sheets are pulled to his waist. His face is gray-yellow, sunken, but his eyes are open and sharp. Louis XIV is sitting up, propped on silk pillows, and he is talking. Not mumbling, not rambling. He is issuing final instructions to a 5-year-old boy standing at the foot of the bed, the child's hand gripped by a governess who is trying not to gag. "Do not imitate me," the king says. "I have loved war too much." It's August 26th, 1715. In 5 days, the man who built Versailles, who ruled France for 72 years, who made himself the physical embodiment of God's will on earth, this man will be dead. And the reason is visible to everyone in the room. His left leg is black, not bruised, not discolored. Black from the toes to mid-thigh, and the flesh is falling away from the bone. 14 physicians stand in a semicircle around the bed. Not one of them will do the only thing that might save him. This wasn't a medical emergency in the way you'd understand it. This was a Tuesday at Versailles, a court where the king's body was managed like a national monument, where the act of handing him a shirt was a political event, and where admitting that the royal flesh could rot was, quite literally, heresy. This is not fiction. This is not exaggeration. This happened in the most advanced court in Europe, attended by the most educated doctors money could buy, and they watched their king decompose alive for 23 days, because saving him would have required cutting the body of God's representative on earth. This wasn't a medical anomaly. This was theology performing surgery. The version of Louis XIV's death, you've been told, if you've been told anything at all, is a dignified exit. The great king, old and tired, dying peacefully at Versailles after the longest reign in European history. What they don't tell you is the smell, the gangrene. The charlatan with a miracle potion who briefly made the court believe in resurrection. And the autopsy results that made the surgeons step back from the table. Here's what this story is actually about, and it's not what you think. Welcome to Unleashed Secrets, where we dig into the blood-soaked truths history tried to bury. You've heard of Louis XIV? You think you know this story? You don't? What I'm about to show you doesn't come from textbooks or Wikipedia summaries. It comes from court diaries, autopsy reports, and diplomatic correspondence that most people have never read. Every week we take the stories everyone thinks they know and follow the sources where they actually lead. Past the myths, past the textbooks, into the details that change everything. By the end of this, you'll know 3 things most people never learn. First, the specific theological reason 14 doctors watched gangrene climb a king's leg for 23 days and applied warm towels instead of a saw. It has nothing to do with medical ignorance. Second, what happened when a wandering charlatan named Brune fed the dying king a secret elixir and for exactly 6 hours made the entire court believe in resurrection. What happened after those 6 hours is one of the most disturbing moments in the history of medicine. Third, what the surgeons found inside Louis XIV's body during the autopsy was so advanced that they couldn't explain how he'd been alive at all. And the political consequence of that body's failure reshaped France for 70 years. We're building a community of 10,000 truth seekers, and we need you to get there. Click subscribe. 1 click, and you'll never miss what the textbooks left out. This is the story of how the most powerful man in Europe built a system so perfect it killed him, and then killed everything he'd built. To understand what happened in that bedchamber, you have to understand what was dying in it. Not just a man, a system. Louis XIV ascended to the French throne in 1643. He was 4 years old. His earliest memory of kingship was the Fronde, a civil war in which Parisian mobs stormed the royal palace, and the boy king had to pretend to be asleep, while rebels checked his bedroom to make sure he hadn't fled. He never forgot that night, and he spent the next 50 years making sure it could never happen again. By the 1680s, he had succeeded beyond what any European monarch had ever achieved. Versailles was complete, not a palace but a machine, a device for controlling the French aristocracy by trapping them in ritual. The Duke of Saint-Simon, a courtier who kept a diary so detailed and so venomous that it remains one of the most important documents of the period, describes how even the act of handing the king his shirt in the morning was a political event. There was a hierarchy for who could be present at the king's lever, who could speak, who could hand him which garment. The entire French nobility was organized around the king's body. Read that again. Not his decisions, not his policies, his body. This wasn't vanity, this was architecture. Louis had studied the chaos of the Fronde, studied how English nobles had beheaded Charles I in 1649, and concluded that the king's physical person had to become sacred, untouchable, quasi-divine, or the monarchy would die. He built an entire civilization around this idea. The phrase attributed to him, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state, may be apocryphal, but the principle was literal. The king's body was France. But what Louis didn't anticipate was that the very sacredness he built around his body would make it impossible to save. Think about what this means in modern terms. Imagine a CEO who has spent decades making himself so synonymous with a company that no one on the board can challenge his decisions, even when the company is visibly failing. Replace the throne with a corner office, the courtiers with executives, and the theology with corporate culture, and the structure is identical. The mechanism hasn't changed in 300 years. The diplomatic historian Lucien Bailly describes the court of Versailles in the 1690s as a place where the king's presence organized all space, all time, all hierarchy. Louis didn't just rule France. He was the gravitational center of European politics. Ambassadors came to Versailles from every court on the continent. A palace with over 2,300 rooms, corridors stretching for a combined 11 kilometers, so vast that a courtier walking from one wing to the other would cover the distance of a small town. French became the language of diplomacy. French fashion, French architecture, French taste, all of it radiated from one man's court, one man's preferences, one man's body. And by 1715, that body was 76 years old, and it was beginning to fail. August 10th, 1715. Louis returns from a hunt, one of the last, and mentions a pain in his left leg. His physicians examine it. They find a dark spot near the ankle. The diagnosis, sciatica. This was not incompetence in the way you might think. The royal physicians, led by Guy Crescent Fagon, who had served the king for decades, were not stupid men. Fagon had trained at the University of Montpellier, one of the best medical schools in Europe. He knew what gangrene looked like. They all knew. Remember Fagon's name. We'll come back to him. But here's the problem. And this is where the story stops being about medicine and starts being about something much more dangerous. So how do you diagnose the king's body with a disease that will require cutting it? Under the theological and political framework Louis himself had built, the king's body was not merely human. It was the body of God's lieutenant on earth. The coronation ceremony at Reims had anointed it with holy oil. The doctrine of the king's two bodies, one mortal, one eternal and political, meant that the physical body of the king carried sacred significance. You didn't cut it, You didn't bleed it unnecessarily. You certainly didn't amputate a limb from it. Modern historians call this sacred paralysis, when a system's reverence for its leader makes the system incapable of saving him. The physicians knew. The courtiers suspected. And for the next 23 days, they all performed an elaborate ritual of not knowing. And it wasn't just the doctors. That's what makes this worse than a story about medical failure. The clergy participated. The courtiers participated. Louis himself participated. Everyone at Versailles was locked into a daily performance of the king's sacred body. The elaborate dressing rituals, the public meals, the healing touch that Louis was believed to possess. He touched thousands of subjects for scrofula, a skin disease, and they believed they were cured. The entire civilization was complicit. This was policy. This was theology. This was architecture. But here's what makes this unbearable. They had done it before. They had cut the sacred body. And it had worked. In 1686, 29 years before the gangrene, Louis developed an anal fistula, a painful, persistent abscess that made it impossible for him to sit, ride, or perform the public rituals his system demanded. The condition was not life-threatening, but it was debilitating, humiliating, and, crucially, invisible to the court. For months, the physicians tried every non-surgical remedy available. Poultices, baths, ointments. Nothing worked. Finally, the king's surgeon, Charles-François Félix, proposed the unthinkable, an operation, on the royal body. But Félix understood the rules. The historian David Gange describes how Félix spent months preparing in secret, practicing the procedure on patients at hospitals and prisons until he had perfected a technique and even designed a specialized curved scalpel, later known as the bistouri à la royale, specifically for the operation. On November 18, 1686, in a private chamber, with only Madame de Maintenon and 2 attendants present, Félix cut into the body of God's lieutenant on earth. The operation lasted 3 hours. It was successful. And here is the mini-inversion that illuminates everything about 1715. The court was told Louis had a minor indisposition. The operation was never publicly acknowledged. The sacred body could be cut, but only in secret, only in a locked room, only if the fiction of inviolability was maintained outside that room. The same courtiers who would later watch Louis's leg rot in plain sight had already lived through a moment when surgery saved the king. They knew it could be done. They had proof. But in 1686, the fistula was hidden. The gangrene in 1715 was not. Everyone could see the blackened leg. Everyone could smell the rot. An amputation could not be performed in secret and explained away as a headache. It would require Louis to appear before the court missing a limb. And that would mean admitting, publicly and irreversibly, that the sacred body was as mortal as any beggar's. The same system that had allowed one surgery in the shadows made another surgery in the light impossible. The architecture hadn't changed. The visibility had. This wasn't a contradiction. This was the system working exactly as designed. The king's body could be saved, as long as no one had to know it needed saving. The gangrene advanced at a pace that was visible to the naked eye. By August 15th, the black discoloration had reached mid-calf. The physicians applied hot cloths soaked in Burgundy wine. They wrapped the leg in towels steeped in aromatic herbs. They prescribed ass's milk, donkey milk, taken internally, which was a standard remedy of the period. None of it did anything except add layers between the king's rotting leg and the noses of the court. The Marquis de Dangeau, another courtier diarist, less literary than Saint-Simon, but more precise with dates, records that by August 21st, the king could no longer stand. The leg was swollen to twice its normal size. The skin had begun to crack. There was, Dangeau notes with the delicacy of a man trained never to speak plainly about royal matters, an odor. Saint-Simon, writing later from memory, is more graphic. He describes the stench and the courtiers' visible distress. Dangeau, recording in real time, is careful, euphemistic. The two accounts agree on the timeline, but diverge on the atmosphere. Saint-Simon paints horror. Dangeau records protocol. The truth is almost certainly somewhere between the venomous memoirist and the cautious diarist. And still no one mentioned amputation. Now imagine what this looked like from inside the bedchamber. Not from the historian's desk, from the room itself. You are one of the 14 physicians. You have trained for decades. You have read Hippocrates and Galen and every contemporary treatise on gangrene. You know, you can see with your own eyes, that the black tissue is climbing. You know that every hour you wait reduces the chance of survival. You know that a military surgeon in a field tent with a bone saw and a leather strap could remove that leg in under 2 minutes and give the patient a chance. You also know that the leg belongs to God's representative on earth. That suggesting amputation would mean telling the court, telling France, that the sacred body is failing, that the flesh anointed with holy oil at Reims can rot like any peasant's. You know what happened to physicians who displeased monarchs. You know that Fagon, your superior, has spent 30 years building his position by telling the king what the king wanted to hear. You stand there. You apply another warm towel. You say nothing. And every morning you come back, and the black line has moved higher. And every morning you say nothing again. That was the geometry of sacred paralysis. Not one decision, but 100 small silences, repeated daily, each one making the next one easier. We'll never know for certain whether amputation would have saved him. Surgical amputation in 1715 was a brutal, dangerous procedure with a high mortality rate. The historian David Gange notes mortality figures as high as 40 to 60% for major limb amputations in this period. But it was performed routinely on soldiers, on peasants, on anyone whose body was not theologically protected. The army surgeon could take a leg in under 2 minutes. The issue was not capability. The issue was permission. But what no one expected was what happened next. Because the story doesn't end with silence. There's one detail I haven't mentioned yet, and it changes the entire dynamic of that bedchamber. Louis himself refused, not just the doctors, the king. When the subject was finally, obliquely raised, Fagon apparently suggested a more aggressive intervention without ever using the word amputation. Louis reportedly said that he preferred to die as he was than to live diminished. This was not mere stubbornness. This was a man who had spent 72 years constructing the idea that his body was inviolable, and who believed it himself. He was dying of sacred paralysis as much as gangrene. He had built the cage, and now it was killing him, and he would not let anyone break it open because breaking it would mean admitting the cage had been a lie. That was agency. Terrible, self-destroying agency. But agency. On August 24th, with the king visibly dying, a man appeared at the gates of Versailles. His name was Brune. History records almost nothing about him except what happened next. He was not a physician. He was not affiliated with any medical institution. He carried a small bottle of dark liquid that he claimed was an elixir capable of curing gangrene. The court was desperate. Fagon, who had spent 2 weeks watching his patient decompose and doing nothing effective about it, allowed Brune access to the king. The elixir was administered, 10 drops in Burgundy wine, and then something extraordinary happened. Louis revived. His color improved. He sat up. He asked for food. He ate a biscuit soaked in wine. He spoke clearly. For 6 hours, the court at Versailles existed in a state of euphoria. Courtiers who had been composing eulogies began unpacking. The Marquis de Dangeau recorded the mood as a resurrection. Case closed. The king would survive. God had sent a miracle through a wandering healer. Except that's not what happened. By midnight, Louis had collapsed again. The elixir, which was almost certainly opium-based, though its exact composition was never verified, had produced a temporary stimulant effect. It had not touched the gangrene. And the gangrene, which had continued advancing beneath the temporary mask of consciousness, had now reached the thigh. The same civilization that gave Europe the most sophisticated court ever built also placed its last hope in a nameless man with an unmarked bottle. Think about what this means. Brune was given 1,000 gold louis and sent away. History does not record what happened to him afterward. But this wasn't one king's death. This was a system dying, the system Louis had built. The doctrine of the sacred royal body didn't emerge from nowhere. It was policy, calculated, rational, documented. The political theorist Ernst Kantorowicz, in his landmark 1957 work, The King's Two Bodies, traces how medieval and early modern monarchies constructed the idea that the king's physical person was simultaneously human and transcendent. The mortal body could age, sicken, die. But the political body, the body that was the state, was eternal. It passed from king to king through coronation. And it wasn't just the theologians who maintained this fiction. The physicians did. The courtiers did. The clergy did. Louis himself did. Everyone at Versailles participated in the daily performance of the king's sacred body. The elaborate dressing rituals, the public meals, the healing touch that Louis was believed to possess. He touched thousands of subjects for scrofula, a skin disease, and they believed they were cured. The most disturbing part isn't that they couldn't save Louis, it's that saving Louis was structurally impossible within the system Louis had created. The architecture of sacred kingship had no procedure for acknowledging that the king's leg was rotting, because the king's body, by definition, did not rot. Rot was for mortals. You've seen sacred paralysis. Every organization that can't tell its founder the product is failing. Every board that watches a CEO drive the company off a cliff because questioning him feels like treason. Every institution that has made one person so central, so untouchable, that the institution would rather die than admit the person is wrong. The mechanism is identical. Only the scale changes. September 1st, 1715. Morning. The smell in the bedchamber was now unbearable even with the windows open. The bandages on Louis's leg had been changed less and less frequently because each change removed flesh with the cloth. The Duchess of Ventadour, who was caring for the young heir, had moved the child to another wing of the palace. Louis had spent the previous days doing what he had always done, governing. He dictated a codicil to his will. He arranged the regency. He gave instructions about the education of his great-grandson. He blessed the child and wept. He told him, "Try to keep peace with your neighbors. I have loved war too much. Do not imitate me in that, nor in the great expenditures I have made." At 8:15 in the morning, the time is recorded precisely by multiple sources, Louis XIV stopped breathing. He had reigned for 72 years and 110 days, 26,407 days on the throne, longer than most people in his era lived in total. No European monarch had ever held power for so long. None has since. The heir to the throne of France was 5 years old. What happened after death is what most accounts leave out. The autopsy was performed the same day. The surgeons, different men from the physicians who had attended him, and notably less constrained by theological etiquette, opened the body. The gangrene was not limited to the leg. It had advanced into the abdominal cavity. The intestines were inflamed and distended. The surgeons, according to multiple accounts compiled by the historian Philippe Erlanger in his biography Louis XIV, were unable to explain how the king had remained conscious and coherent for as long as he had. The degree of internal decay was incompatible with the clarity of mind he had displayed in his final days. Read that again. The body was further gone than should have been survivable. And yet Louis had been issuing policy directives, composing his testament, and counseling his successor. Here is the terrible irony. The same will that had made him build the sacred body, the will that had created Versailles, subjugated the nobility, dominated Europe for half a century, was the same will that kept him conscious while his organs liquefied. And it was the same will that prevented him from letting anyone save him. What happened to France after Louis XIV died is the final proof of sacred paralysis. He left the most powerful nation in Europe to a child. The regency that followed, under Philippe d'Orléans, immediately dismantled much of what Louis had built. The centralized court system weakened. The treasury, already drained by Louis's wars, collapsed further. Within 74 years, the monarchy itself would be destroyed. In 1789, a Parisian mob would storm the seat of power, exactly as the Fronde mobs had done in Louis's childhood. Except this time, there was no sacred body to protect. The revolution didn't just kill the king, it killed the idea that the king's body was divine. And Fagin, remember Fagin, the chief physician who had diagnosed sciatica while watching gangrene, who had spent 30 years rising through the court by telling the king what the king wanted to hear, who had allowed a charlatan access to the royal bedchamber when his own medicine had failed. Fagin survived Louis by less than 3 years. He died in 1718, stripped of influence, his reputation destroyed. The man who had once controlled access to the most important body in Europe spent his final years in obscurity, blamed by the court for the very paralysis the court itself had demanded of him. Saint-Simon, in his memoirs, is merciless. He describes Fagin as a man whose competence had been consumed by his obedience. The system had used him exactly as designed, and then discarded him like a soiled bandage. They had spent 72 years proving the king's body was untouchable. They produced a system so dependent on one body that when it rotted, everything rotted with it. I have loved war too much. The words that had sounded like humility in the bedchamber now read like a verdict. The king's own autopsy of his reign, delivered before the surgeons could perform theirs. This wasn't tragedy. This was engineering. This was inevitability. The bedchamber at Versailles still exists. You can visit it. If you stand in the right spot, near the gilded balustrade where the courtiers would have gathered, you can see the bed where Louis XIV spent 23 days decomposing in front of the most sophisticated court in Europe. The room smells of floor polish now, of old wood and tourist dust, and the faintly chemical scent of preservation. No lavender, no ambergris, no rot. They've cleaned it. The way every institution cleans up after a founder's failure. Carefully, thoroughly, until the only thing left is the furniture and the myth. The smell is gone, but the architecture remains. The Sun King died the way all suns die, collapsing inward in the dark, while everyone pretended the light was still there.